Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Higginbottom, talking about international enforced, disappeared and experience in South America. He is a senior academic at Kingston University. Andrew.
Sri Lanka, even after the massacres of 2009. And I mean, Jayasuriya didn't fall from the sky. If you look at his formation, his uniform even, and so on. I mean, most of the top officials, including, I suspect, him, although I'd quite like to have the evidence, were probably British trained. So, you know, the projection of someone like Jayasuriya is typical of the neo-colonial relation which Britain has with Sri Lanka, which is that, in fact, ever since the Second World War, ever since independence, Britain has been training the Sri Lankan military, and although they might be the actual actors, if you like, the commanders in the field, very much of the policies that have been carried out in Sri Lanka have been aided and abetted, if not directed in some occasions, by Britain. And in this report, it refers to Phil Miller's work, which is about Britain's Dirty War in Sri Lanka. And if you haven't read that, I do urge you to read it, because in fact, some of the things that I'm going to say about the dirty wars that take place in Latin America, I just need to make this big, so I'm not used to the map.
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, it is fine. Okay, yeah. So that's a picture of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, where 30,000 people were disappeared under detention. It's quite well known the extent of disappearances under the military dictatorships. In Argentina, in the late 70s, early 80s, estimated 30,000 people disappeared. And it's known as La Guerra Sucia, the Dirty War, and I've already made reference to that. I think what's happening been happening in Sri Lanka is in many respects also a dirty war. And the main inspiration on behalf of the victims of these human rights abuses were the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, which is the main square in Buenos Aires. And during the military dictatorship, every Thursday the mothers would go there. In fact, one of the founders, one of the first leaders of the Madres herself was disappeared. So it took an awful lot of courage for them to do what they did. Similarly, and also very well known, the disappearances in Chile under General Pinochet, actually fewer people, but still a lot. It's very clear in Chile the connection between torture and disappearances. I mean, it's the campaign of the relatives was for disappeared in detention. So it's quite clear where people were taken into detention, and the degree of torture was enormous, and some of the torturers, now nearly 40 years later, have actually been brought to book in a court. But by and large, Chile enjoyed international impunity. There's a very simple reason for that. It's because it wasn't only Pinochet who was the author of the coup. Kissinger was just as much the author of the coup as Pinochet was. And in fact, the United States had a dry run. They tried to have a coup against Allende after he was elected, before he assumed office. And all the way through the 3 years of the Popular Unity government, the US was destabilizing, mobilizing against what they objected to, which was a left-wing socialist government. And famously, Nixon told the CIA to make the economy scream in order to get rid of the government. And many supporters of the government in Venezuela today can see very strong resonances to what's happening in Venezuela in terms of this type of mobilization to bring down a left-wing government. So this sort of approach shifts the focus well away from the individual responsibility, which it certainly is, to a much more strategic responsibility, including of the US government. Kissinger justified not only during but before and after the necessity of regime change in Chile, and you've got that's the quote is from here. Okay. Now the coup had a twofold purpose, and this might seem an obvious point, but I'm going to come back to it in a little while, right? The coup against popular unity had a twofold purpose. One was to remove the government, whose policies neither Pinochet nor Kissinger could accept, but also it was to eliminate the cadres of the left, which is not only, of course, the government, but like the grassroots community, political, social organisations. There is a question here, which I would throw to you, about the question of who shares responsibility when this happens, right? There is a clear chain of command in the military, but what about, slightly more generally, the intellectual authors of the crime of disappearances, particularly in terms of politicians and rather, completely transparently in the case of Chile, also the US government. If we look at what happened in Argentina, we'll take Argentina as an example of social mobilization against disappearances outside the official structures. So there has been a whole politics of transition, which has also been referred to quite rightly in sort of the famous trade-off between reconciliation, truth and justice. And the first official transition to democracy gave absolutely no justice for the disappeared. There was a full stop law, and then another law which was known as the due obedience law, which basically said the military top ranks and bottom ranks respectively cannot be brought to court for what they did under a military dictatorship. This in effect was overturned by popular mobilization. One of the strands of this was, one of the things that the military in Argentina did is when women who were taken in detention and tortured, many of them were young women and many of them were pregnant. And what the military did is they killed the mother and took the baby. And they gave the baby to military families. So what you have is something like 500 children were brought up, not by their biological parents, but by military or police families. And so one of the strands of opposition was the grandparents of these children trying to find out where they were and regain contact with them. So you don't only have the mothers that have disappeared, but you have the grandmothers that have disappeared as well. And then another sort of intergenerational effect was you also have the children that have disappeared, another group who, completely frustrated by the lack of official progress, decided to take action into their own hands, as had the grandmothers in fact. And what the children did is they set up, I mean when I say children, they're by this time teenagers or in their 20s, they set up their own popular justice mechanisms, and when they found out that somebody was a torturer, somebody was responsible for disappearances, they would go to their workplace, they would go to their home, they would spray paint their home. You can see, I hope, these mock road signs and so on saying, beware, traffic beware, this is a genocide on this street and so on. So they really decided to take the campaign out onto the streets out of frustration with the official processes. Disappearances has in effect been an official US policy throughout Latin America for at least 50, 60 years at least. One of the clearest examples of this took place in Colombia in the early 1960s. The US was very nervous about the spread of the Cuban Revolution into Latin America. They were sending military advisors all over the place, including into Colombia, where they had a special survey team under this person, General Yarborough, where they recommended the setting up of civilian groups whose actual role was very close to what has become known as the paramilitaries of today. Human Rights Watch published a really crucial report in this regard back in 1996, where they're referring to another wave of US close control of the Colombian military in the early 1990s. And I don't know if you can read the quotes there, but they basically said two things. First of all, the US, again, sent special advisors, and they urged the Colombian military to reorganize itself along particular lines to involve death squads and intelligence squads. So effectively what they set up were killer networks which had three components to them. The first component was the eye, to do the intelligence work. The second component was the brain. And they speak in this sort of language, by the way, to control the whole operation, to fund it and to organise it. and the third was the ham, to carry out the killings. And they, generally speaking, subcontracted the killing, separated that from the intelligence gathering. So what you have is a very sophisticated and thought through and well documented, systematic, organised division of labour to disappear people. The main mechanism of disappearance is in Colombia. Colombia, by the way, has been recognised by every British government as a democracy. So what you have now is not an open dictatorship, but a country which has a semblance of the formalities of democracy, but in reality is a dictatorship against sections of the population. And the main instrument of disappearances, and in general, it's not only disappearances, I have to say, it's in general terror against the civilian population, have been these right-wing paramilitary despots in Colombia. So President Álvaro Uribe, who was president for 2 terms, early 2000s, something like 15,000 Colombians were extrajudicially executed or disappeared in this period. Again, this period was celebrated by the British government, including, of course, in that period, the Labour government, as well as Conservative Lib Dem governments. And when, after he came out of office, there was some degree of opening and some degree of spilling of the beans by the paramilitaries. And what the investigator found in Colombia is that disappearances weren't only individual, there were whole groups of people who were put into hidden secret graves and so on. And so there's a whole phenomenon in Colombia of discovering the disappeared graves. You may have heard it's a very famous case of a 43 students who have disappeared in Mexico. I actually, to my shame really, wasn't aware of this figure, but since 2007, i.e. in the last 10 years, there are 30,000 people missing in Mexico. 30,000 in 10 years. And this again is not an open dictatorship, it's seen as a democratic country and so on. The general envelope under which these state disappearances take place is the war on drugs. And so the dirty war idea of the 60s and 70s is again with us today in Mexico. These students, the students are a very interesting phenomenon. They came from a left-wing background. They came from a culture of social mobilization in the southern state of Mexico called Guerrero, which means warrior by coincidence. And in Guerrero, this college was the product of a popular struggle to educate working class young people to become teachers. And the government said, these people were disappeared because of drug gangs and so on, and the parents completely wouldn't accept this, and they've continued to fight for the truth. They still haven't got the truth, unfortunately. This is not a well-known case. This is a case I know about because of my work with Colombia Solidarity Campaign, and about a third of the population in Colombia, again not well known, is of African descent. Part of the whole enslavement of African peoples, taking them to Latin America. And amongst them, there's a town of Villarrica, which is in southwest of Colombia. And we had a report in May. We have a long-term contact with this community. We help them on sort of education programs and so on. In 1 month, 5 youngsters were killed in April, May this year. But we're now getting reports, just in the last couple of days, we haven't yet been able to properly document it, but we're now getting reports of 24 young African Colombians who have been assassinated in this one small town in Colombia this year, in a supposedly democratic country, right? There is a very strong link between their assassinations. I mean, the phenomenon of disappearances here and extrajudicial executions aren't really separated. One of the issues here is the disappearances are taking place against a section of the population which is already socially invisible and seen as being, if you like, without full civil rights in the first place. So the assassinations and the social cleansing which takes place is part of a broader pattern of marginalization of African Colombians. And you can see some of the pictures there of some of the people who have been killed. You won't be able to pick it up because of it's too small, But what we've got there is the actual death threat which was sent to this community before these assassinations took place by the latest incarnation of the paramilitary death squads. In Colombia, disappearances have been fairly widespread. They are an informal system of control of the population. One of the big issues in Colombia has been the phenomenon of large investment projects by multinational corporations, and the communities around those investment projects are socially cleansed. And disappearances are the main mechanism of this social cleansing. And what I mean by social cleansing is moving of populations and eradicating all germs of social movements or sympathy for, if you like, left-wing opposition to the multinational. You can just about see the picture of Colombia. In the eastern plains of Colombia, they've now left, but BP were a major oil producer there. In this one region, this one department, it's called Casanare, they were operating there for about 15 years. I tried to investigate this area. I was not allowed to go. It was too dangerous for about 10 years. Something like 3,000 people have been disappeared in this one area. Okay, and you can see the picture down below of one of the relatives that disappeared. Many of the facts about this case began to emerge when the two paramilitary groups started to fight each other and spill the beans on each other. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known. So what I'm trying to say is, in Colombia in particular, you have a situation of organization of people who carry out disappearances on a fairly organized and systematic scale in what, again, is supposed to be a democratic country. The person who's theorized this or articulated what's going on most clearly is Padre Javier Giraldo, a Jesuit priest who was with us on the Bremen Tribunal on the genocide of Tamils, and he basically pointed out that you have effectively a para-state structure, and this is necessary for a state which wants to carry out dictatorial repression, but at the same time has the facade of being a democratic state. It does seem to me that quite a lot of these characteristics could be applied to the case of Sri Lanka as well. The young woman, Sandra, in the picture there, she was killed last year, an environmentalist in southwest Colombia again. There is a movement in Colombia called Movice, which is the movement of victims of state terror. So the social movements in Colombia see disappearances and extrajudicial executions as a closely related phenomenon of state terror. I'm nearly finished. I just want to say a couple more things. The first is it's interesting also to reflect on the analysis of disappearances coming from Latin America. I've already referred to Javier Giraldo. Another human rights theorist, if you like, is Daniel Fierstein from Argentina. And he is basically saying we shouldn't just think about disappearances as something which is a legal category, but we should see this as a deliberate process of attempted social re-engineering. So he puts disappearances in the context of genocide, as I think you quite rightly do as well in the case of the Elam Tamils. And he basically is saying, why are the state authorities doing this is to try and break the social structure which they're presented with. They want to not only break the individual, they want to break the social context in which they were in. And I think there's an awful lot of, again, a lot of resonance with the situation of Elam Tamils. My very last point is in Latin America, the movements against disappearances are primarily inspired and led by women. And through their agency, there's been the production of collective historic memory. And this is also something quite perhaps relevant to reflect on, which is what does historic memory mean? And they have disputes. I mean, they're not a monolithic movement. There are different political tendencies or points of view about how to fight for the disappeared. And this tendency here, Hebe Bonafine articulates this point of view most strongly. she's from Argentina again, and they basically say we should remember the disappeared by seeing them as our comrades who are still with us on the one hand. On the other hand, we should continue to fight for the ideals for which their lives or they've been snatched away from us. Okay, so there's a slightly less emphasis. I mean, they have fought for getting the facts of the case and so on, but there's also, if you like, a regeneration of the political motivation of the people who have been taken without any explanation. And you can see some of the quotes there. Today we feel that our children are more alive than ever. They live on in everyone who struggles with their people. That's it. Thank you.
Andy, before you go, I just want you to tell the people your experience of how the South Americans are dealing with and what lessons we can learn from that and apply within the Tamil community. You are a very good supporter of the Tamil community for a very long time, and so what lessons we can learn from South America in the and when whatever we can do in the international community. So I just want you to elaborate on that, please.
Well, following on the previous two contributions, in fact, all of them, I mean, the UN avenue is a dead end, and it has been a dead end for quite a long time, to be honest with you. That's why we did the Permanent People's Tribunal in 2013, because we wanted to establish an independent basis. If the UN won't do it, then we have to do it ourselves. That was what we thought. And in doing the Bremen Tribunal, what we also decided was to involve prominent figures and intellectuals from social movements around the world. So we had somebody from Burma, we had two people from Latin America, and so on, right? And they bring with them a whole experience which distrusts the official structures and has more trust in the power of social mobilization. And that, above all, is what I would say is the message from Latin America, which is to rebuild the capacity of social mobilization. I mean, that's why I was pointing out the examples of Argentina and so on. I'm certainly not against trying to bring criminals like Pinochet to book. I helped the Chileans when Pinochet was sort of trapped here in London. But I think demonstrably right now, in terms of the situation in Sri Lanka, that is just getting nowhere. So go out to the people of the world, go out to other movements fighting against maybe not as acute injustice, but similar degrees of injustice, and form an alliance with them. I mean, the United Nations is meant to represent the peoples of the world, and transparently it doesn't represent the peoples of the world. It represents, United States, what they want, what Britain wants, and was it Macedonia and Montenegro, whoever it was who supported the resolution on Sri Lanka, right? I mean, it's a joke in terms of being any forum where the will of the peoples of the world is being expressed. So we have to find another way. So that's and including, just finally, if you like, I'm very pleased to see that there's brothers and sisters from other communities here. Many of the peoples of the world are here in London. Because of Britain's colonial history, many people have suffered and continue to suffer under the structures of colonialism. I see what happened in Sri Lanka, I tell you, as much the responsibility of the British to this day as of the Sri Lankan government. And we heard about the DUP guy, right? The DUP, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty much a fascist organisation, right? I mean, they conducted murders against Catholics in the north of Ireland. Ian Paisley Sr. Sanctioned systematic killing of Catholics in the north of Ireland, right? That's what they're based on, and that's what the government of Britain today apparently rests its majority on, right? I mean, you couldn't think of a more unholy alliance. So we need to look for much more holy alliances with the oppressed peoples of the world.
Thank you, Andy. And Andy is the associate professor of Keystone University, and he has been involved with South American freedom struggles, and as well as he's a very good supporter, and we always support the freedom struggle of Ulam Tamils. Thank you very much for your contribution. Doris Jones from North Borneo, and she is in a solidarity with Tamils, and she will speak about the disappearances and other issues.
At present, on the next one, at any time, will go to prison under the Malaysian government. Warrant an issue in 2 years ago, just because I blew on the whistle. I cannot step my foot in any airport in Malaysia. Wanted person reported flag on the red flag for Interpol, but however, Interpol don't want to go next. So yeah, I'm agreed to gentlemen and all the speech done because we have the same problem, but it's the numbers that's the major problem for us to trace is the number, because many of them go into the prison. Either the luckiest one come out disabled, and the unlucky one, we don't know where they go. They disappear for a reason, they heart attack or die in prison, we don't believe that. However, I strongly believe if we work together in solidarity, any nation, although we are listed in the United Nations or we're not, because normally, as far as from my knowledge, the oppressor is on top of the list in the United Nations. The one that being oppressed, not listed. And our mountain is hidden from the world. So I agree to gentlemen say we need to go otherwise to solve this. One day will come the day. I will attend any conference or any solidarity with other nation at any time, although I'm not in London, but I'll try. I cannot say much more because I'm thinking of my warrant and I will go to prison one day. Yeah, that's all I can say. I can't tell you the numbers because the numbers is massive numbers. And I was a child, but now I'm the one that you mark. So thank you, but I'll certainly see you again.
This one is Sisku Adi Ayuki Tapi. He's a British Southern Cameroon organization, and he is also they are also fighting for their freedom, and he will speak now.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sisi Kwayokabe. I'm the chairperson of the Governing Council of the Southern Cameroon Cameroon. It is very befitting that we are here because I think we come here to display a very shameful situation. The British government abandoned us in 1961. Before 1961, we were a trust territory of the United Nations under British support. And they gave us a choice of two options: to become independent in 1961 by either joining the Federal Republic of Nigeria or by joining the Republic of Cameroon. Now, you have to play back a couple of years earlier. Our people had just left the Nigerian House of Chiefs. So the option was actually just join French because you wouldn't go back to where you had just left. So 61 years later, we are now faced with a situation where, like Doris, I cannot go back to my country. Because after the humiliation and the torture for 56 years now, I'm counting, because our president, or the president of the Republic of Cameroon, because I wouldn't call him my president, he came and entered into our nation, brought his army on the 1st of October in 1961, and since then, my people have been treated like second-class citizens and slaves. And last year, I just take you up quickly to the timeline because we don't have much time. But last year, in October, when our lawyers, who were British-trained lawyers, decided to say, but enough, we can't go to court, where the magistrate of the court is a French-trained lawyer. He practices civil law. When the lawyers attempted to raise their voices, they were beaten up. As we speak, some of their wigs and gowns are still in police custody. Now, when a nation starts by arresting the lawyers, we begin to ask what law is reserved for its common people. And true to form, in November, when the teachers also protested, because we found ourselves in a situation where the teachers, the children go to school, they are predominantly English speaking, but they go to school and they are taught chemistry, biology by somebody who doesn't understand English. When the teachers tried to object, they were not only beaten, but their students, the military in Cameroon, the gendarmes and the police went into the dormitories and raped the girls, brought them out, beat them up, and that's when the killing and the disappearance started. Because at the end of that story in November, 41 students were arrested and taken to a military court. The military, they went to the capital of their country and put them in jails. And when they were asked to bring the children so that negotiations could start, they brought 21 of the 41 children. They could not bring the other 20 because as of that time, 4 of those students had been killed. Fast forward, as we got to January, the thing escalated. On the 17th of January 2017, the people with whom this government was negotiating, they banned the association and they started the arrest of the leaders. And that's when the real disappearance started. As we speak, I'm really happy to speak here because we fear a very impending genocide that is going to happen in Cameroon. Because this week on Monday, there was a tug of war where the government says schools must resume. And we have found boycotts of schools, as pitiful as it is, they become our only weapon to make a case. And the United Nations really need to come, particularly the United Kingdom. They brought us into this dismal situation we find ourselves. And I'm here today as the chairman of the Governing Council to call the United Kingdom to save the situation they created in the first place. Now, we have had 12 mass graves reported. Now, if we put a minimum of 10 people in one mass grave, then we're talking of 120 people. These atrocities are from November 2016 till date. A few people were released on last week out of too much international pressure. They have over hundreds of people in jail, and I will leave you people with some slides. I mean, a lot of material that you can independently verify. When we put a lot of pressure and the international community asked them to release some people, last week they released a few people. The stories that those people are recounting, one of the inmates said at some point, 2 people were dying every day in the jails, and they have been in jail for over 8 months. If we become conservative and we say maybe in 2 months, 2 persons were dying, and this is just one jail. So we're talking about 60, 100 people dying. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in a world where until the situation becomes a genocide, until there's so much bloodshed on the streets, nobody listens. And I really want to thank the organizers of this conference for bringing us here, because we hope that somebody will hear the cry of the people of Southern Cameroon. The proof of their determination to leave is such that on the 4th of September, on Monday, the government had put everything it had at its disposal to enforce to make sure that schools start, up to sending military people to go and threaten secondary schools in preparation for school resumption, up to sending generals to go into secondary schools to prepare that the schools start, up to sending chiefs to go to schools to make sure that the schools will start. With everything they threw at our people, because they have two tools in their toolkit. They have the weapon of money for corruption, and they have the weapon of military force. But everything they threw at our people on Monday the 4th of September, only this week, our people demonstrated their willingness to leave by doing the only thing they can do, by staying at home, open their Bibles and read, open their Qurans and read, and praise God. That's how we survive, and that's how we continue to survive. Thank you very much.